Well, happy Dads and Grads Day to you. Thanks for being here with us this morning. Yeah. We're going to celebrate our graduates in just a bit, and just want to say happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. And like Jacob just said, your relationship with your father here on earth might not be great, but you have a great Father in heaven, and so you can cry to Him and go to Him at any time you'd like. Hey, I'm Pastor Aaron. You might not recognize me today. This is not what I typically wear when I'm here, but I was at a wedding yesterday, and said, you know what, I'm going to wear that suit tomorrow because I think I'm going to make a point with it, okay? And so you'll see what I'm doing in just a moment. But I'm typically wearing jeans. In fact, last week I had on jeans and a T-shirt, and actually we're the kind of church that you can wear a suit if you want to. You might be the only one, like I am today, or you can wear jeans and flip-flops or shorts or whatever you want to, whatever you like to wear. But we're a different kind of church. You can wear anything that you want when you can. Well, not anything you want, but you know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying. But I grew up at a church where everybody dressed up. Any of you grew up in a church like that? Where everybody dressed up, and you didn't talk about certain things. You didn't talk about money. You didn't talk about sex. You didn't talk about what we're going to talk about today for sure. You just kind of kept it. You looked good on the outside, right? But nobody talked about what was really going on the inside. So in this church I grew up in, everybody looked good and nobody talked about those things, and everyone sat still and quiet. Like I remember one time I was acting up a little bit, kind of towards the front row, and my dad, he used to do the sound in the church, and so I thought I was getting away with it, and I was just goofing off with some friends, and the next thing you know, I feel this tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and my dad's sitting right behind me. He gave me that look, that look that dads give. My dad has this ability, I can't do it, but he has this ability to raise only one eyebrow, and it points like all the way up to the top of his head, and I know when that happens, like I'm in a lot of trouble. But anyway, so we sat, we were quiet, we didn't talk, we didn't move, because the thing they would always say to us is, you're in God's house, you're in the Lord's house, you don't do that. And meanwhile, when my parents were in meetings, we were running in the hallways and goofing off and breaking into, we used to run as fast as we could down the hallway and then slide on our knees to see how far we could slide, and then we'd mark it, and then the next person would go. This was what we were doing when my parents were in meetings. We'd slide down the banisters. There was a second story in the church. We'd slide down the banisters to the bottom. So we actually swam in the baptistry one time, but that didn't go over too well. I couldn't hide the fact that I was soaking wet after a church. But anyway, I wore this today because I want us to know that looking good on the outside doesn't mean that you love Jesus. You know that? Looking good on the outside. You can look like you have it all together, but in reality, there's things going on inside of you. We can fake it. And that's kind of why I wore this, so that you could know we can fake it. And we can avoid talking about real issues. We can avoid talking about things that are tough. In fact, we talk about tough things here. And this series has been a tough series for us. We've been talking about some tough things here. You remember our it's like sentence in a series that we have. You can write it down if you want. But the idea that we've been talking about is that if you're underwhelmed with Jesus, then you're going to be overwhelmed in this world. That's kind of the plain and simple. If you're underwhelmed with Jesus, you're going to be overwhelmed with the things going on around you. And then you can kind of flip it at the same time and say, if you're overwhelmed with Jesus, then the things around us don't seem so big anymore. We're underwhelmed by those situations. And so this morning, I would hope a bunch of you would be here because we're going to talk about something real difficult. We're going to talk about depression and anxiety, things that a lot of people don't talk about in church, but we're going to talk about here. Depression and anxiety. I think it's important for us to talk about it because in the last 20 years, prescriptions for anxiety and depression have increased by 400%. We are the most depressed country in all of the world. The United States is. And so I wanted us to talk about that. We're also the richest, by the way. I wonder if those two things correlate. We're the richest and most depressed country in the world. And there are plenty of people that will tell you Christians don't get depressed. Christians don't get anxious. And I just want to say to them, have you ever read this book before? Have you ever heard of guys like Moses, Elijah, Jonah, Paul? You don't even have to have a church background, and you've heard of one of those four people, right? Have you heard of them? Well, let's look at a couple verses about them for just a moment. In Numbers, this is Moses saying, in Numbers chapter 11, he says, I'm not able to carry all this burden alone. You might relate with that. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, then just kill me at once. Those are the words of Moses, by the way. Elijah, in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 3 and 4, it says, Then when he was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life as the life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a tree, a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life. Does that sound like depression, maybe, to some of you? In Jonah chapter 4, verse 3, it says, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8 says, For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. So he's under some severe persecution there. It says, For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. And so anyone that tells you that Christians aren't depressed or anxious is out of their head, really, because it is possible. Then we find David, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. David, guess where we find him today? Well, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 22, look where we find David. It says, and I'll give you all the story on the front end of this, but this is where it ends. It says, David left Goth and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So we find David where? In a cave. In a cave. Ever felt like you were in a cave before? He was having a really tough season in his life. We're going to see it in just a minute, how everything just unraveled in his life. It was just spiraling out of control. And I think I think sometimes we read this and we think, well, David was in a cave. It was more than that. It was way more than that. You'll see in just a moment. The reality is that he was running, that he was at the end of his rope, that he was done, and he didn't have anything else to do. He was at his wit's end, and so he crawls into a cave with nothing else to do. He just sits in the cave. You may have been there before. All right, so the plan today then is to look at how David got in the cave, and then what were his responses then to that? Like, what did God do in him? What did God do through him? What can God do in you? What can God do through you when you find yourself in these moments in the cave, and even seasons? Okay, so let's look at David's situation for just a moment. We've got to back up to before this, where he's in the cave, and you're just going to have to trust me a bit. I'm going to give you the cliff version. Is that what they call it? The cliff version of his story. Is that what it's called? Cliff Notes. Cliff Notes of his story. And you can go back. I'm really summarizing lots of chapters here. I would suggest you go back and read 1 Samuel to see how David got where he was. But I'm going to give you the story of his life, and you just have to kind of trust me as we walk through. I'll point to certain verses as we go along the way, but you'll just have to kind of follow along with me, okay? In 1 Samuel. Everything for David changed on one day. It changed with the throw of a sword or a spear, okay? So everything in his life was just kind of going as is. Things were going well for David. And then one day, just with the throw of a spear, everything changed for him. Somebody actually threw a spear at him. It wasn't just a somebody. It was the king. Saul threw a spear at him and tried to pin him to the wall with the spear. And that's the moment that everything changed for David. And everything began to spiral out of control from that point forward. You may have had one of those days where things like that happen to you. And then you begin to spiral out of control. Maybe it's a diagnosis from a doctor. Maybe it's the death of a close friend or loved one. Maybe it's the moment that a spouse looks at you and says, "I don't want to do this any longer." Or maybe you lost your job or failed a class in school, or whatever the case might be. It's those moments when things begin to spiral out of control. And that's what happens here with David. It's with this throw of the spear by the king when things begin to spiral out of control for him. Saul was the king, and he was extremely jealous of David. And I'll tell you why. Because Saul was the reigning king, David was the got anointed king. And I don't know if you see any problems with that, but it caused a few issues for them. Imagine you're at work, right? And your replacement is working beside you, and you're not ready to retire yet, right? You get it? You get what I'm saying? That's what was going on. And not only that, but he was better at the job than you. He or she was better at the job than you. And he or she was loved by all of the people more than you were, okay? That's the situation that we find David in. And Saul was just completely jealous of that. And it wasn't pretty. Not only that, but everything David touched turned to gold. You know anybody like that? You work with anybody like that? Everything that he touched he was an amazing warrior. The battles that he went in, he was very strategic. He was a commander, and he won the battles. Like, he was strategic. He could whip anybody, it seemed like. In fact, the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 18, verse 16, you can write that down. It says that all of Israel and Judah loved David. That's what it says. And he wasn't the king, but they loved him. He was the anointed, God-anointed king, but he wasn't the reigning king. And all the people loved him. Not just that, but people would sing songs about David. Like, they would just make up songs on the spot. Ladies in the street, the Bible tells us that there were women in the street that would sing a song. They made up a song that said, Saul has slain his thousands, David is 10,000. So I don't know how you sing that song. I'm not going to attempt to do it, but that's the song. Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. And they were singing in the street and giving this praise to David. And as you can imagine, Saul wasn't really happy about it. And so Saul calls David in to speak to him. And then as he comes in, that's when he throws the spear at him and tries to pin him against the wall, and that's the moment everything changed for him. So he fled into the night, and everything changes. And at that moment, David lost 5 really important things to him. Just with the throw of the spear, 5 things began to unravel in his life. I'm going to give you those 5 things. You can write them down. The first one is that he lost his position, lost his job, basically. He was, as I said, he was a commander. He was faithful. He was heroic. He was a soldier. He was a leader. He was powerful. He had thousands of men fighting for him at all times. He was on the fast track. And now it's all gone. Don't know if you've ever lost a position like that or lost a job, but it's all gone. With the throw of the spear, he leaves Saul's palace, and that's it. That's it. He'll never serve in Saul's army again, ever. Ever. So he loses his position. The second thing he loses is his wife. You can see it spiraling. Okay, so he loses his wife. As he runs home to spend time with his wife and probably to let her know what's going on and all that stuff, Saul is in hot pursuit of him. You do remember that David's wife was Saul's daughter, excuse me. You remember that? It was the gift of the person that defeated Goliath. And so David defeated Goliath, and Saul gave his daughter to David to be his wife. So he goes home and he explains the situation to his wife and what's going on. And they come up with a plan. And the plan is this. They were going to, the wife sewed a pillow together and put goat hair all over the pillow, and then placed it in the bed and pulled the sheet up over it so that they would think that he was asleep in the bed. You guys ever do that trick? It's the oldest trick in the book, right? Any of you teenagers ever do that? You sneak out at night, I'm just trying to help the parents out. Any teenagers want to admit that they've done that? None of them? Okay. So that's what they do. They put this pillow with goat hair all over it in the bed, pull the sheet up so that when the soldiers come in, they'll think that he's asleep in the bed. And he sneaks out the backside and leaves. And what happens is they come into the house and they start to stab the pillow with the goat hair on it because they think it's David, but David's gone out the back. That's not him. And so Saul says to his daughter, why have you lied to me? Why have you deceived me? Why have you done this to me? And she flips the whole thing on David and actually says, David said that he would kill me if I didn't do this. And so that's the moment that he lost his wife. And then he lost his mentor. So as you've probably in situations in your life, you've run to somebody that you trust and love, someone who's spoken into your life. And for David, that was Samuel. And he runs to Samuel to spend some time with him. Remember, Samuel was the one who anointed David as king. Goes to spend some time with him. He finds out that Saul is on hot pursuit again, and he leaves Samuel and loses Samuel. So he loses his mentor. Then he loses his best friend. He lost his best friend. If you know the story about David and Jonathan, it's a really cool story. Again, I would suggest you go and read it. That's chapter 20. Jonathan was Saul's son and best friends with David. And so he spends some time with Jonathan. And Jonathan says, Dad would never hurt you unless he told me he was going to do it first, which wasn't true. They come up with this plan of how they're going to figure out if Saul's really going to hurt David. And the plan worked. They found out that he really was. And then Jonathan goes one way, and David goes the other. And so he loses his best friend. And lastly, he loses his self-respect. Believe it or not, when we read there in that one verse where it says David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam, you might say, well, what's the big deal about Gath? Well, in chapter 21, verse 10, it says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. You say, well, what's the big deal about Gath? What's so important about that? Well, Gath was actually the home of the Philistines, the enemy of Israel. Goliath was a man of Gath. And so here's David wandering around in enemy camp. The man that killed their greatest warrior, by the way. And he's wandering around in their camp. He gets recognized, which you would expect. He gets recognized, and look what it says in what he does once he's recognized. Look what it says in verse 12 of chapter 21. It says, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks out on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, look at this man, he's insane, why bring him to me? In other words, I've got enough nuts around this place already. There's enough Philistine nuts there already. So why are you bringing another madman to me? So he acts like he's mad. He's lost his mind here. So here's David. He's lost his position. He's lost his wife. He's lost his mentor. He's lost his best friend. And now he's lost his self-respect. Even his enemies wouldn't receive him. He couldn't even find solace in his enemy camp. He didn't have anything. And then we find him in the cave. So after that, it says he goes to the cave and he gets in the cave. So does that sound like a bad season we kind of painted the picture. Sounds like a pretty tough season for this guy, for David. And so he goes to the cave. Again, he's been running. He's through. He's done. He's just going to crawl in this cave, and there's nothing else to do. And then he writes these words. So if you've got your Bible, you can look over at Psalm chapter 142. This is the words that David wrote while he was in the cave. And we'll learn from this in just a moment. So look what it says in Psalm 142. It says, this is the Psalm of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell all my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watches over my way. In the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see, there is no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison. It's interesting that he would say that. I think sometimes anxiety and depression can feel like a prison, and I think that's where he's at. Set me free, God, from this prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. So he writes this prayer while he's sitting in a cave and had just had this horrible time in his life. You can see the desperation in him. He's saying, there's no one concerned for my life. There's nothing for me. No one cares for me. But I cry to the Lord. You're my refuge. You're my portion. I'm in desperate need. And he continues to cry out to God, God, please free me from this prison that I'm in. that I may praise your name. That may be a prayer that some of you have prayed before in your own words, I'm sure. It's a very open prayer. It's a very honest prayer. And what can we learn from it? What can we learn from a man who's suffering from depression or anxiety or a combination of both, potentially? What can we learn from it? And what should be our response? What's his response and what should be our response when we find ourselves in those types of situations? Write down a few things here. We see first that he heard enough to admit his need. That's an important piece. He heard enough to admit his need. When you're suffering from anxiety or depression, you need to tell someone. You need to tell a friend, a parent, a coach, a teacher, a leader, maybe your group leader. You need to tell somebody that can share the hurt with you. Don't forget as well that we see David sharing his hurt, declaring his hurt to the Lord as well. Don't forget that either. So it's important for us to not only tell somebody that we love and trust, but also to tell God what's going on in our life as well. A lot of times we walk around with our suit on, and it's like, I'm good. We kind of got an I'm good attitude. I'm good. I'm fine. Everything looks good on the outside. And it's not until something crashes that we realize something's broken. Like, why do we wait until and keep putting on this facade until something crashes, and then that's when you have to go into emergency mode and try to fix it. Why not tell somebody on the front side? Why not tell somebody you love and trust? Tell somebody that will share the hurt with you. Tell God what's going on in your heart and life. Why stay silent through it? We see David sitting down and he uses words like cry out, and he shares what's going on in his life. You'll see in just a moment that God answers his prayer. But he didn't keep quiet. You've got to admit the need. And why do we not admit the need? Good old-fashioned pride is the issue. Good old-fashioned pride. We don't want anyone to know that something's going on with us. And if you continue to hide it, if you can continue to deny it, you'll never get better. You never will. David hurts enough to admit his need. The second thing he does is that he was honest enough to cry for help. So he realizes that while he's in the cave, and you'll see in just a moment what happens here, that he can't do life alone. So he cries out to God again. He cries out to God. And I want to say to you, this kind of bleeds into the first point too, that you can't do life alone. We were never intended to do life alone. And that's why we have, as our church, we want to see you connect with God, and we want to see you connect with others, because you're not meant to live life alone. You're meant to live life in relationships. You need somebody who's going to get on their knees with you and pray with you, not just pass you in the hall and say, I'll pray for you. I'm praying for you. You need somebody that's going to pray with you, that will get on their knees and pray with you. You can't just say, I'm going to just pull myself up by my own bootstraps. That doesn't work. In fact, I would say to you, how is that working for you? Does it work? Doesn't work. We can't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We need each other. We need to be connected with other people. Jesus, the strongest man in all of the Bible, didn't go at it alone. He surrounded himself with people. In fact, when he went into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, he took some people with him, didn't he? Now they kept falling asleep. They weren't very reliable for him, but he took them anyway, and they kept falling asleep. But he took friends with him. So what's going on in your life? Don't go at it alone. Number 3, he was humble enough to learn from God. And how often do we go in a cave and not learn what God's trying to tell us? And David was humble enough to say, if I'm in the cave, so be it. So be it. Let's be faithful to, while we're in the cave, to learn what God may be teaching us. Maybe, just maybe, he's trying to say something to us. I mean, what we typically want is we want relief. Like, we want to get out of the situation. And God says to us, I'm going to walk you through the situation. I'm going to walk you through it. And what are we going to learn from it as we go? It's so easy for us to say, God, change my spouse. God, change my family. God, change my job. God, change the... Why don't we approach it and start saying, God, change me? change me. Change me, God. Change my heart, God. Do a work in me, God. And he was humble enough to learn while he was in the cave. The fourth thing is that is it 4 or 5? I can't remember. Anyway, he recognizes that God was in the cave. God was in the cave. So David's here in this difficult place, and God begins to shape him. You're going to find out in just a minute. God begins to shape him. He's struggling. He's hurting. He's facing some of his worst days, and yet he finds out that God's in the middle of all of it. And what we see God do with David is he reroutes his life, like he changes his life in a really powerful way. He gives David a fresh start. So it says in that verse in 1 Samuel, go back to 1 Samuel, in chapter 22, the verse that we just read. It says, David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. So they went to the cave. Imagine this for a moment, okay? So David's hanging out in the cave, all alone, and he hears, David, you in there? And his dad calls out to him. And so then his dad crawls in the cave with him. Imagine that. Kind of comes in and just plops down right beside him. His family comes in and plops down right beside him. And then look what happens in verse 2. It says, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So as he's in the cave, and I do think it's prophetic for us, by the way, to think about the fact that when we're in the cave, we have a God who will come and sit in the cave with us. We have a Father who will climb in the cave and sit down with us. I think that's a prophetic word for us as we read this. But then after that, here comes those who are financially strapped. Here comes those who are struggling in their marriage. Here comes those who have been hurt before. There's those that are struggling to forgive. They all come in. How many people came in the cave? 400 people sitting in the cave with David. That's incredible to me. All of them in the cave. And what we see is that God's using this to change the direction of David's life. These 400 men that were in the cave with him became his army. So he just got up, started to train them. Here's how you shoot a bow and arrow, or whatever the case might be. He starts to train these men, and they were his next army. This was the beginning of what we call David's men of valor. Have you ever heard of that? Or valor probably is the right word. Some of them would become leaders. Some of them would become officials. And they would even be in service in the palace when David ends up back in the palace. They'd be in his service. So the next king of Israel is training his troops in a cave. Seems unusual, doesn't it? But God's ways aren't our ways, are they? They're not our ways. And so David just jumps up against to train these guys, and his life has changed from this moment. He learns from what God's trying to teach him in this moment, and his life is, the direction of his life is completely changed at this moment. I would ask you guys, do we serve the same God as David? Have you been struggling? Like, have things in your life, have they begun maybe to spiral out of control? Maybe you're on the bottom right now. Maybe you're just starting to spiral out of control. I want you to know that God loves you. And that when you feel like you're in a cave, that he'll crawl in there with you. And if you'll just listen to what he's trying to teach you, he can take whatever the pain is in your life, and he can use it for your progress in the same way that he did for David. And we can know that in Jesus Christ, there's always victory. I know there are many of you that could stand up in this place and say, I suffered with this depression or anxiety. And I'm as this series has been very honest, this is stuff that goes on in my own family, okay? I want you to know that. So I'm not speaking at you like we're learning this together. I hope you know that. But there are people who could stand up in here and say, I went through this time of depression. I went through this time of anxiety, and God used it in me in this way. God used it for my progress. He took that pain and He used it for the good. And He will. In fact, when we were praying this morning, Vicki used the verse Jeremiah 29:11. That's where I'm going to finish up. The worship team can come and get ready. But look at what it says here. And it's not going to be on the screen because I didn't tell them to put it on the screen. So you're going to have to either find it in your Bible or write it down and read it later. But in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." So it says here, He says, "For I know," God knows. I think that's what you need to know. God knows. God knows. God understands and knows the anxiety or the depression or the things that seem out of control. He knows. He says, "For I know." He knows. He knows how to get you out of it. He knows how to walk you through it. He knew the plan for David all along, and He knows the plan for you. He knows it. He knows it. He says, "For I know the plans I have for you." He knows every detail. Every single detail. I don't think we could handle the plan if we knew the plan, right? But He knows the plan. He knows every detail of the plan. We just have to trust Him and say, God, I trust You. To know that you know the plans that You have for me. You know them, and I trust You. He says, "I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." Can you trust His word? When God speaks, can you trust Him? He says, declares the Lord. You can trust Him. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, or plans for the good, not for evil." You have a dad that wants the best for you. I have an earthly dad that wants the best for me. I know some of you don't have that, haven't had that opportunity. But I have an earthly dad that wants the best for me. I'm a dad that wants the best for my kids. I would do anything for them, and there's been times when they've been hurt, and I've watched them get hurt, but I still love them. We have a God who loves us. We have a Father who loves us, that has plans for us that are for good, that will prosper us. And even when they seem like the plans are bad and they don't make sense to us and they're foggy and we don't understand it, like we got to know. We just have to know that His plans are best for us and they're to prosper us and not to hurt us. We feel like it's hurting us, but do we trust Him when He says in His word that He declares that these plans are for our good? "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." And I know things get foggy. I know. And again, these things go on in my own family and my immediate family, like in the family that lives under the roof of my house. I understand these things, okay? It's foggy, and we think, God, rescue us from the prison that we're in. we don't understand what You're doing here, God. Please rescue it. Can you change it? Like, we don't want to be anxious anymore. We don't want to suffer from this depression any longer. Like, rescue us from this prison. And we just have to step back and say, God, when we're in these moments in the cave, we know that You love us. We know that you have the best for us. And we don't understand what's going on, and it looks really foggy to us and really cloudy. But on the other side of it, God, we know that one day we're going to look back and say, that's what You were doing, God. That's what You were doing, good Father, the one that loves me, that wants me to prosper. I see it now. I see what You're doing. And we might not ever know that till we get to the other side and we're in heaven with Him. We may never know. But we have to trust and know that He has plans for us, and they're plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Do you believe that? Do you believe it? Let's pray. God, thank You that You are a good Father. And God, we can know that you have plans for us that may be completely different than the plans we have for ourselves. And the plans that You have, we can trust You in them. We can know that you have a purpose for our good and to prosper us, God. To give us hope We need hope, God. To give us a future, we need a future, God. And I pray, God, for anybody in this room, even in my own home, that suffers and struggles with anxiety or depression, God, I pray that we would learn from David, God, that we would cry out. We would have people around us that would walk with us. God, we would cry out to you and know that you will walk us through it. God, that we would trust you. That we would give over control to you. That we would pray, that we would praise, that we would proclaim who you are, God. God, use them. Use anyone here that struggles with any of those things. God, use them as a testimony. Use them in the lives of other people, God, to walk them through difficult times because they really understand what it feels like to be anxious or depressed, God. God, we know that we will experience trouble here, God, but we thank you that we can know that you have overcome this world and that one day, this is not home for us, and one day all of that will be gone. No more anxiety, no more depression, no more sin, no more struggle, God, and we'll be in your presence forever. God, we look forward to that day, but while we're here, help us to trust you and to know you have our best in mind at all times. God, we thank you for being a good Father, and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen.